Marcus Reaper Cain had spent half his life wearing a warning. The patch over his heart read desert snakes, but it was his face that warned people off. The weathered jaw, the thin white scar that cut across one eyebrow like an old road. He moved through Copper Ridge Roadhouse like a king in a small country, his chair at the head of the long table, his laugh the one that broke up arguments, his nod the one that settled bets. People told stories about him. Prison riots, narrow escapes, rides through winters that could kill a man. He had a presence like chrome and thunder, and the town leaned against it the way a weary traveler leans on a porch rail. The roadhouse sat on the edge of the desert like a bunker against the sun, chrome, smoke, and stories carved into every scarred surface. Neon bled through the windows as the heat slipped away. The jukebox was a low hum of old rock. Empty bottles lined the bar like little altars to long nights. Leather smelled of oil and cold coffee. Lou, the bartender, moved behind the counter with hands that had steadied more tempers than he could count. He knew the faces, the debts, the small, quiet dangers that lived in a bar after dark. That night, Reaper wore the weight of distance. He'd been in the saddle earlier than usual, rolling in from a charity run, his mind still on the miles and the rhythm of engines. His mouth was sour with dust and beer. The chapter wives clustered in the corner, trading stories and hush with the same practiced cadence, while the desert snakes, patched, scarred, loyal, took their places like churchgoers at a weekly liturgy. Children were rare inside. The club tried to keep the bar a place for grown men, but a small visitor was about to change that rule. Outside, 7-year-old Sophie Martinez moved like someone who had learned to make herself small and invisible, and then broke the rule on purpose. She had the oversized helmet she insisted on wearing, barely fitting her head, an old gift, the visor cracked, and shoes 3 sizes too big for the way she ran. Dust clung to her ankles. Her father had taught her how to notice the little things, a shoe out of place, a missing towel, the sound of a truck that didn't match the others. Miguel Martinez had been a truck driver for as long as Sophie could remember. He knew the desert, the back roads, how to read a sky that hid storms. He taught Sophie how to listen, and listening had become her way to survive. For 2 days Miguel had been late, then not home at all. The phone on the roadhouse bulletin board had a note against it, missing. People said he might have decided to ride out to family, or a local company had rerouted him. Sophie didn't have the luxury of rumors. She had the vivid, precise memory of seeing his truck at the last rest stop, the look on his face when he'd promised he would be home by dinner. That promise unspooled in her mind like a loose thread.
She'd been living in the alley behind the roadhouse for 3 nights, finding cold coffee, scavenging day-old fries, watching people come and go. The desert had taught her tools most adults had forgotten. On the 2nd night, she was crouched behind a tilted dumpster, her knuckles pressed to her knees, when she saw a man move through the kitchen door. He wasn't irregular, nervous, thin, the kind of man who looked like he owed his clothes to someone else's generosity. His hands shook when he pulled a small vial from his jacket. The kitchen door, propped open against the heat, let a strip of light fall across the floor. Sophie watched him tilt the vial into a bottle of whiskey set by Lou's hand. The label had a small sunburst emblem. She knew that bottle. She'd seen Lou put it up a few minutes earlier when the bartender came out to take a call. The man wiped the vial on the hem of his shirt, glanced around as if checking a scene in a play, then walked back into the night with a gait that made it clear he wanted to be forgotten. She could have run and hollered from the alley, stayed hidden and told no one. She chose the other thing. She ran, dust spinning from her heels, and burst through the door. The roadhouse folded toward her like a living thing. Heads turned, conversations paused, the jukebox's guitar stringing out into silence. Every head swung like a metronome. Sophie stopped in the middle of the room and pointed. Her voice was small but carried. Someone put something in the whiskey. People made a sound that wasn't laughter but close to it, nervous and quick. Lou wiped his hands on a towel and squinted. Reaper looked up, the room folding into the single plane of his face. The whiskey sat at his elbow. You could feel the air tighten. Everyone knew Reaper drank from that bottle sometimes. He'd been offered it for years. The ritual was as old as the club. Sophie took a step forward. Her eyes were bright and full of the kind of authority that comes from only one place, truth. She told what she'd seen in a rush of sentences that didn't let the room breathe. She named the vial, the thin man, the way he had poured. She pointed at the bottle, then at Reaper, then back at the kitchen. He did it. I saw him. Reaper watched her. For a heartbeat, the barroom held its breath, as if the whole thing might evaporate. He'd been through alarms like this. Pranksters, people looking for attention, adults bent on trouble. There was a tension in him that came from years of carrying too much truth and having no place to set it down. He had a long list of reasons to be skeptical. He also had a long list of nights where he'd acted on his instinct and regretted it. He was tired. He had a charity run in the morning. He had a reputation to shield and men to think of. "Kid," Reaper said, voice low, the kind that calmed and cut. "You sure you're not messing with us?" Sophie didn't understand the need to be small anymore. "I saw him. He poured it."
In the bottle. Lou's hand stalled. The bottle shone in the neon. Sweat gathered on the neck of the glass. Reaper gave a short, rough laugh. "We got more mouths than you've got excuses for, sweetheart. Where are you skulking in alleys anyway? You ought to be in bed." It was a believable failure, not a one-dimensional cruelty. It was fatigue, old habits, a reflex to dismiss things that threatened the smoothness of a night he considered under control. He was a leader used to making split calls, and most of them were calluses that had kept the club whole. Tonight he made the other sort of call, one that happens when a man trusts his own assessment more than another's small voice. He reached for the bottle. A single swallow. If stories have pivots, this was the pivot. The micro hook clicked closed. A single swallow. And everything changed. If you love real-life suspense with a heart, like and subscribe for more Bike Diaries. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The bar music fluttered back on. Jokes filled the space like a tide. Reaper's shoulders eased, and people resumed their conversations as if the world had not tilted. Then, in the middle of a sentence and a laugh, Reaper's focus slipped. He set the glass down with a hand that trembled. An odd little thing, at first, like a tremor in a radio. He blinked once and again, as if trying to clear a fog from a windshield. He called out to Lou. The word came out wrong. It was thick, slurring at the edges. Someone reached for him, and he waved them off with a grin that didn't land. The grizzled hand that had steadied dozens of brawls paused near his head, as if feeling for the light switch. That pause turned to something else. A collapse that didn't blow like a cannon, but hit like the thud of a tire on a curb. Reaper went down. Not like the end of something, but like a critical part falling out of a machine. Heads swung. The jukebox cut mid-chorus. Lou screamed for an ambulance. The desert snakes moved with the kind of speed born of habit and fear. Men who knew when to act and when to protect. Panic is a blunt instrument. It flails wide, but it also sharpens purpose. The room broke into motion. Someone started CPR. Someone else called 911. A patch covering the Desert Snakes logo flashed as men peeled from shirts and pulled vests. The wives pushed forward with a steady force that made even men blink. They cleared the area. Reaper's breath came fast, then ragged. He was sweating in odd circles, his bandana soaked, his face white where it had been tanned the color of old leather. Sheriff Tom Rez arrived with a calm that was not visual. He held the law like a tool he understood intimately. His presence tightened the edges of the night. He barked soft orders and let the EMTs do their work. Reaper's pupils were uneven. There was a smell that made people's throats clamp, like metal in the faint chemical tang of something sweet and wrong. The sheriff's jaw said. He covered the scene, eyes sweeping to the bottle on the bar, then to the kitchen window that framed a slice of desert sky. The minutes stretched thin as wire. Paramedics stabilized Reaper enough to load him into an ambulance. He rattled off something that sounded like a memory or a dream, hands scratching at his pockets for a lighter he hadn't had. The town's streetlights glared. Engines droned overhead when the ambulance left, taillights a thread of red through Copper Ridge's dark. When the dust of the immediate emergency began to settle, the shape of what had happened took hold. Sophie stood by the door, small and smeared and trembling. Lou crouched near her, his big hands like a shelter. Reaper's brothers moved like a ring of protection, eyes not leaving Sophie, as if some fragile truth might blow away if anyone breathed too loudly. It was in that quiet that the sheriff talked to Sophie, kneeling to meet her eye to eye, because small people with big facts deserve to be heard with respect. Sophie told her story again, but this time she was steadier. The sheriff's questions were precise. He was the kind to measure words for evidence. He listened for detail, what the man looked like, which hand he used, what he wore. He asked about the vial. Sophie mimed the tilt of a wrist. She could describe the label on the bottle and even the sound the cap made when it clicked. Sheriff Harris walked through the bar like a man reading a book with grim pages. He bagged the bottle and sent it to the lab.
He asked Lou for the security footage. Lou ran to the back room with the look of a man watching his own life suddenly become a case. The cameras had been cheap and quirky, but they covered the kitchen doorway and the bar. Sometimes they caught things people missed watching with their own eyes. Running footage is a slow, clumsy thing that becomes sharp under pressure. The sheriff watched in a hush as the thin man moved into the kitchen light, produced a small vial from his jacket, and tipped it into the whiskey bottle. He watched the man's hand shake, the slight pause as the man glanced toward the Roadhouse patrons, and then the man slipping away into the dark. The footage caught the label on the bottle in a few frames. Lou, by the monitor, leaned forward as if his life itself depended on the clarity of that grainy image. "We'll need to identify him," Sheriff Harris said without drama. "We need to know who this man is and why he did it." Who he was became clear when the sheriff checked local gas station receipts and a small convenience store's electronic ledger. The thin man had bought a vial of automotive coolant. Ethylene glycol has a faint sweetness and is known for being dangerous if ingested, and he'd paid cash. But at one store he hadn't been able to hide his hand. His thumbprint had been caught by the cashier's register when he opened his palm to get change. It matched a name the sheriff already had a list for: Danny Vickers.
Danny Vickers had been a prospect with the Desert Snakes. He'd been rejected months earlier for reasons the chapter kept to itself: temper, loyalty tests failed, arguments that had ended badly. He'd hovered on the margins ever since, watching the man he wanted to join with a mix of resentment and hunger. People who get told no for the same thing that keeps others in are dangerous. They either walk away or they make the answer someone else's problem. When the sheriff brought Danny in for questioning, his hands were too clean and his eyes too narrow. He denied everything for the first 30 minutes, then answered in jerks. He admitted buying the coolant, but swore he intended to wreck a machine, not poison a man. He said he wanted to scare Reaper, to prove he could be dangerous, that he'd been desperate, housing troubles, a scuffle with a man who wouldn't hire him, a life that went nowhere. Prosecutors don't much like intentions that look like negligence. Juries don't like men who practice dangerous thinking. There was a pattern: text messages where Danny raged at Reaper for turning him away, CCTV evidence of him near the kitchen the day before, and fingerprints on the bottle when the lab cleared the scene. Legally, the pieces began to grip. The sheriff had the footage. The lab had the analysis showing traces of ethylene glycol in the bottle and in Reaper's system. Witnesses placed Danny near the bar. Arrest was inevitable. The sheriff cuffed Danny with quiet efficiency. At no point did the Desert Snakes take the law into their own hands. They stood on the periphery, angry, raw, but under the sheriff's watch they did what they had to do. They let the state take the man whose actions had nearly killed their leader. But the story's other thread had been tugging tight. While Reaper was in the ambulance and the sheriff pulled together the case, the Desert Snakes were doing what they do best. They used their network. The same loyalty that had room for scars had room for favors and contacts. Reaper's chapter sons tracked down leads on Miguel Martinez through the routes he ran, the businesses he'd stopped at, the loading docks that had his name in their ledger. A phone call, then another, then a signal that something had been found. An overturned truck on a back road outside town, a bed of scrub where a man had been trapped between cargo and cab. The desert takes its own time, but the club had no patience. They organized a search party with men and flashlights, radios, and an old rotorcraft the chapter president had renting arrangements with through a contact. Helicopter blades shredded the quiet desert air as the machine cut to a small opening where the truck lay half buried in scrub. Miguel Martinez had been alive, dazed and bruised, but alive, his leg trapped, his phone smashed. He'd been held there by tangled cargo, unable to call for help, the elements beginning to work on him as the sun set and nights in the desert turned teeth.
They pulled him free with a tenderness that surprised even those who'd expected only tough hands. The medics at the scene stabilized him and sent him straight to the hospital. Sophie, who had never left the Roadhouse, was led by two women with soft voices. The reunion that followed was simple and furious. Father and daughter clinging like survivors, each other's faces familiar and new. There were tears, yes, but mostly there was a quiet that felt like relief, and a healing that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with being found. Reaper, meanwhile, rode the line between danger and waking. The lab work had confirmed antifreeze. He was treated, monitored. The emergency doctors kept the details clinical for the press when it came. What matters was that he was alive, that the toxins could be filtered, that the prognosis was to rally if the heart held. There were hours in the hospital that moved like a slow-breathing animal. Worry, machines, the soft beeping that always made some part of a person feel like they were a machine too. Reaper spent oxygen and grief on a bedside, a man who had once thought himself indestructible, learning how fragile that idea could be. When he finally had the strength to sit up, the Desert Snakes were there in a careful line, not to gloat, but to guard. Reaper's first coherent sentence was a confession of sorts. "I should have," he began, voice hoarse, and then he stopped. Confessions in men like him are not dramatic speeches. They are small admissions, like taking off a helmet and exposing a bald spot. "I should have listened," he said. "I should have listened to the kid." That moment mattered because the men around him were not looking for a beat to point fingers at. Instead, they looked for a way to fix what had been broken. They used their money and connections to cover medical expenses that wouldn't be fully paid by insurance. They put in calls for legal counsel for Sophie and her father because the law can be cold and a kid can be lost in its machinery. They arranged temporary housing and a job referral for Miguel so he could get back on the road with a plan that kept Sophie safe. The club treated restitution as a practical, lived thing, helping to fix what the crime had wrecked. Reaper asked for Sophie. He wanted to speak to the child who had been the hinge between death and life that night. They brought her to his room. She came in with the oversized helmet still clutched in her hands like a talisman. She was small, but there was a steel in her look that had nothing to do with her being 7 and everything to do with her being brave. "I'm sorry," Reaper said, and the apology wasn't for the fact he'd been poisoned. He did not owe her that, but for the split second in his head where he had not trusted that voice. It was a confession to the failure he alone was responsible for. Sophie had the blunt honesty of a child trained to say things outright. "You almost died," she said.
Her voice wasn't accusing so much as stating fact. "Dad wasn't home. I came to find help." Reaper swallowed. He reached out, and in a gesture that stunned everyone in the room, he took a tiny, dust-smudged hand and put it on his patched vest. "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved me, and you didn't even know the word for hero yet." The Desert Snakes had traditions for marking acts of courage. They also had rules. They refused to glorify violence or to take the law into their own hands. So the honoring was careful and meaningful. In a small ceremony at the Roadhouse, with the sheriff there to nod and cameras off to the side, they presented Sophie with a small honorary vest, more a symbol than a membership badge, stitched with a patch that read, "Honorary Desert Snake." It was a garment heavy with meaning and lighter by necessity, a token that would remind her she had been seen by people who lived on roads and knew how to keep promises. Reaper handled the vest with reverence. He put it over Sophie's shoulders the way a priest might cloak an altar boy, and when he did, his hands were steady for the first time since the collapse. He told Lou to make sure her family had the help they'd need, told the sheriff they would cooperate in the investigation, and pledged the club's support for any legal steps the Martinez family needed. Danny Vickers' arrest was not a footnote. The sheriff presented evidence in court, security footage, the receipts, and the lab tests that corroborated Sophie's testimony. Witnesses from the Roadhouse testified about the Thing Man and about Reaper's collapse. Danny's motive was examined, the rejection, the resentments, the texts. He pled through lawyers. In a legal system that can be slow and blunt, justice was a technique of patience. Charges, arraignment, trial. The legal machinery was not a spectacle in the Roadhouse, but a sober thing. Danny pleaded guilty to attempted poisoning and related charges, and the judge, considering the will and circumstances, handed down a sentence that balanced punishment and the need to keep a community safe. In the weeks that followed, life found small ways to stitch itself back together. Reaper recovered physically, and more importantly, his sense of humility grew like a slow graft. He kept a small photograph in his wallet, a candid shot of Sophie with her new vest and Miguel standing proud beside her. He wrote one short note on a scrap of paper and folded it into the wallet. Never ignore the small voice. It was not a sermon. It was a reminder. Sophie and Miguel moved into a small apartment sponsored by donations arranged by the club and a charity the Desert Snakes had ties to. Miguel took a job driving a local route until his old contract at a national carrier could be reinstated. He kept his promise to Sophie, who started school again with a clean backpack and a haircut that made her look older than 7, but not less brave.
The chapter kept watch, not out of possessiveness, but out of community. They visited. They brought meals. They fixed minor things around the apartment. They never tried to make Sophie into a mascot. They treated her like one of their own, because she had, in a way, saved one of them. Her bravery became part of their narratives, told at long tables, not as a trophy, but as a lesson. Time changed the edges of the story. The media interest faded. Reaper went back to riding. Long days, slow roads. There were runs to charities and fundraisers, and every few months a damp-voiced man at the Roadhouse would point to his wallet and say, "That kid kept me alive." Reaper's apology became a story he told younger men as a caution, a parable about listening. Years later, Sophie would press her shoulder against the frame of a small photograph on the living room wall.
A snapshot of a night that should have been ordinary, and wasn't. The vest, now faded at the edges, hung framed in the Martinez's apartment. It was displayed not like a trophy, but like a warning and a promise. In the picture, Reaper smiled with an awkward tenderness. Miguel, older on the face but softer in the eyes, held his daughter like he had never let go. When her own children asked about it, Sophie would point and say, plain as the necessity of water, "Listen, sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that shout the loudest truth." She'd tell them the story without exaggeration, how she had seen a man pour a vial, how Reaper had let pride and fatigue rule him for a breath, how that breath nearly cost a life, and how the community had come together to make what was broken whole again. She would tell them about Sheriff Tom Harris and Lou behind the bar, about Danny Vickers in court, about the desert snakes who used their contacts and wallets for healing rather than vengeance. Reaper kept the scrap of paper in his wallet until it wore thin. He replaced it once, then again. Each time he would read the note and feel the pressure in his chest that says, "You are a man with obligations." He'd never been the sentimental type, but he understood now that being hardened didn't mean being closed off. It meant making room for mistakes and owning them when they happened. The town changed in small ways. Lou's bar saw fewer unspoken tensions and more attention to tiny things. Someone trained to check labels, to watch the kitchen more closely. The sheriff held regular visits to small businesses about safety. The Desert Snakes organized a fundraiser for victims of crime, and the Martinez family had a small trust set up to keep them solvent during hard months. In the end, the shock the title promised was real, but it wasn't the kind of cheap sensationalism that leaves people hollow. The shock was that the toughest man in the room had nearly been felled by the thing most of us would ignore, a child's insistence and a small vial.
The real astonishment came later, in the way a community moved like muscle to heal the wound. It was the town's insistence that the right thing be done, and that those who make mistakes have to make reparation beyond mere words. Reaper's transformation was not instant or theatrical. It was a steady narrowing of the distance between being feared and being responsible. He learned to ask the question instead of snapping the dismissive answer. He learned to hand his skepticism into a check that measured proof rather than his comfort. He learned to listen. Sophie grew. She kept an oversized helmet for as long as she could, and then a smaller one fit her better. She became the sort of person who noticed things: the bus schedule, the neighbor's dog, the ache in angles people thought they could hide. She taught her kids to look at labels and to trust the small voice that nags until you do something. At the Roadhouse, the original bottle's broken glass was framed and put away. Lou kept it on a shelf with other oddities. It became a talisman for carefulness. The sheriff kept a file that had, in neat stacks, the receipts and the footage that had put a man in manacles. The Desert Snakes kept their honor the way it had always been kept, privately, with a lot of noise and a lot of work. Years later, when Sophie explained to her children why a patch and a photograph mattered, she would say it in a voice that held the dry humor of desert air and the warmth of a woman who'd watched a community choose to protect the small things that make a life livable. Sometimes the people who seem toughest, she would tell them, are the ones who need you to be brave for them, and sometimes the people who seem smallest are the ones who save everyone. The framed vest hung on the wall, a reminder that honor isn't grand statements, but small acts of restitution. Reaper kept the photo of Sophie in his wallet. On his better days, he would pull it out and smooth the corner with a thumb that had handled hard things. The note that had once fit into the wallet was replaced, too, by other small scraps with other reminders. He'd collected them like a man collects tools: a note to call his sister, a list of errands, a reminder to go to the charity run. The lessons settled into the town in that quiet way lessons do, through repetition, through people telling the same truth until it becomes habit. In the end, the dangerous moment had been as raw as anything could be. A near death, a man collapsed, a thin line between life and loss. The salvation had been ordinary in its elements: an observant child, a community that answered, law that did its work, men willing to own the wrong and repair it. If this story reached you tonight, remember the small voice you might have ignored in your life. Maybe it was a child's warning, a coworker's concern, a neighbor's plea. If it mattered to you, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.
Tell us in the comments, when has a small voice changed your life? Subscribe for more true-spirited stories, and keep listening.